What is the worst thing that could happen to a nation? War, natural disasters, or pandemics? Perhaps all of these are capable of destroying any civilization on Earth. However, we often forget another catastrophe just as dangerous, and that is economic. Recession throughout world history. There have been economies that collapsed due to the influence of various individuals. One of them was the head of state with the longest tenure in the world, Teodoro Obiang, who became president of Equatorial Guinea in 1979 after overthrowing his uncle. He consistently won re-election with support rates as high as 90%. But contrary to public expectations, the leader of Equatorial Guinea had always hidden the truth that he used money from national aid programs for personal purposes. Furthermore, according to Transparency International, unfortunately, the exact amount was never disclosed, but it is clear that the consequences caused by this leader were immense. Despite being a country rich in oil and gas resources, about 60% of Equatorial Guinea's population lives on just $1 a day. Similarly, in Egypt, there was also a leader with comparable levels of corruption, Hosni Mubarak, who had a prestigious military career in Egypt before 1981. He served as vice president under Anwar Sadat and became president after Sadat's assassination. During his tenure, economic policies were created primarily to facilitate corruption for the ruling elite, despite being known as the country with the sixth best oil quality in Africa. The lives of the Egyptian people were no better than those in Equatorial Guinea. Fortunately, in 2011, he was overthrown. During the Egyptian Revolution and another case in Argentina, the country is currently suffering its worst economic crisis in 32 years, according to the National Institute of Statistics, and census inflation in January rose by 254% compared to the previous year. The main reason for Argentina's dire situation can largely be attributed to the legacy of Juan Domingo Perón, who became president in 1946. Inspired by Mussolini's fascist ideology, he implemented an A2R workday, raised wages for the poor, and introduced welfare programs for the lower classes. Initially, these policies aimed to protect the national economy from foreign competition. However, they also led Argentina to become isolated in international trade. Today, the country's politics are still dominated by his legacy. Argentina's exports have been declining sharply compared to global export rates year after year. These were all economic recessions that occurred in world history, leaving consequences that are almost impossible to recover from, yet they are nothing compared to the inflation in Zimbabwe. So what really happened to this country? Robert grew up in a poor family with a carpenter father and a teacher mother in southern Rhodesia, but instead of following in his mother's footsteps to become a respected teacher, he joined the African nationalist movement calling for an independent nation led by black people, and on February 14, 1980, the people of Zimbabwe participated in the country's first general election. 2 months later, Robert Mugabe was sworn in as the first prime minister, marking the beginning of a new era with high hopes for national prosperity. Indeed, Zimbabwe quickly drew international attention, thanks to the eloquence of its new leader, despite having been imprisoned and labeled a Marxist terrorist under the former regime. He called for reconciliation and declared that evil is evil, whether committed by white against black or vice versa. Mugabe's goal was clear: to fully unlock Zimbabwe's potential and elevate a basic right that must be free and compulsory. Within 1 year, student enrollment increased by 232%, and by 1984, the number of secondary schools had risen by 587% soon after. Zimbabwe's education system was recognized as one of the best in Africa, hailed as a political miracle. Around the same time, more than 500 healthcare centers were built, allowing millions to access
public welfare, most importantly.
The economy had a strong start, as agriculture was heavily supported by the government. After the war, Mugabe transformed his country into what was known as the breadbasket of Africa. In August 1981, Mugabe recruited military trainers from North Korea to form an elite brigade he named Gukaranti. This unit functioned as his personal weapon, used to pressure his political rivals. Like many politicians, Mugabe aimed to secure his position within the ruling party at a time when the nation was recovering from civil war and undergoing development. Mugabe wanted to minimize unnecessary political conflict after weakening the opposition. He merged two parties to form a one-party state using his power. He amended the constitution, dissolved the Senate, and tightened control over legislative bodies holding the reins of the entire nation. Mugabe's first move was to implement bold economic policies primarily aimed at protecting domestic industries, while strictly regulating foreign investments. Countless other policies made investing in Zimbabwe extremely difficult. As a result, state-owned enterprises gained the most advantages, which strengthened the ties between the government and business leaders. To secure support from the majority of voters, Mugabe spent enormous sums, increasing spending on education, healthcare, and paying various allowances to veterans. However, these actions led to government expenses spiraling out of control, forcing the state to rely heavily on international loans. Asterisk, by 1989, half of Zimbabwe's total GDP had to be allocated to government spending, while the unemployment rate rose to 26%, facing pressure from international lenders. The government was forced to revise certain policies to maintain its regime. The chosen approach was to devalue the currency to boost exports, while also implementing price and wage controls to combat unemployment. However, the economy quickly plunged into a deep recession, as most industries struggled against a flood of cheap imports. At the same time, severe droughts significantly reduced agricultural output, and Mugabe failed to cut government spending, which increased the country's debt burden. Ultimately, the government resorted to printing money to cover expenses, leading to annual inflation of 20%. That same year, the Veterans Compensation Fund was depleted due to corruption among officials, prompting veterans to stage protests, demanding their rights. In a desperate move to quell the unrest, Mugabe agreed to pay a monthly allowance averaging double the salary of civil servants. The World Bank was dissatisfied with this decision and immediately suspended a $100 million loan, demanding a detailed repayment plan. In response, Mugabe abruptly announced he would default on the payments, causing Zimbabwe's currency to lose 75% of its value in just one day. Consequently, Mugabe tried every means to increase taxes to ensure the government's solvency. Feeling cornered, he decided to send troops to the Congo under the pretense of supporting the country's leadership during a civil war. In reality, his motive was to exploit resources to replenish Zimbabwe's dwindling funds. But instead of gaining anything, the intervention cost $6 billion and led to further aid cuts. By the end of the decade, Zimbabwe under Mugabe's leadership was burdened with massive debt, lacking international support, and trapped in economic recession. On September 11th, 1999, a coalition of civil groups, labor unions, and white farmers formed the Movement for Democratic Change, which quickly emerged as the main opposition to Mugabe's government, fearing a crisis. Mugabe hastily called for a referendum on a new constitution aimed at shifting the political balance in favor of the ruling party. The proposed constitution included provisions to grant government officials immunity and to extend Mugabe's term by 2 more years. But how could he win public approval for this? Our president made an unexpected move: land redistribution. Notably, the land in question was mostly owned by white citizens since before independence, so the government offered an enticing deal, redistributing farmland to black citizens while refusing to compensate white landowners in order to maximize national interest. This move clearly aimed to salvage Mugabe's declining reputation. If the new constitution were passed, Mugabe would retain power and have more time to find solutions for the country's economy. Sadly, the plan failed, and the constitution was overwhelmingly rejected. Humiliated by this political defeat, Mugabe launched what he called an immediate land reform, essentially reducing ownership to a matter of might, where the strong simply took land from the weak, chaotic, and violent land. Seizures erupted nationwide, displacing hundreds of thousands of farming families. The problem was that very few of the new landholders actually had legal rights to the land, and no one really knew where all the land went. Within just 3 years, Zimbabwe transformed from Africa's breadbasket to a country unable to feed itself. Famine struck, and people were left with few choices: steal, rob, barter vegetables for food, or starve. As for the question of where the money went, one had to first ask whether the notes in their wallet were even worth anything. Recognizing the seriousness of the crisis, Mugabe considered 2 options: either cut spending which might worsen the recession, but offer long-term hope or print. More money, he chose the latter. The government released higher denomination bills to address the short-term crisis. But as expected, the plan was ineffective, although the money supply increased tenfold within 2 years after the land. Seizures, cash shortages persisted. Banks began to collapse as their existence lost meaning in a desperate attempt to prevent total economic collapse. Mugabe printed even more money, but this too had little effect. People gradually shifted to using foreign currencies, weakening government control over the economy. Realizing this, Mugabe took drastic measures. He imposed withdrawal limits so low they couldn't even cover bus fare, and imposed heavy penalties on shop owners who accepted foreign currency. Farmers and miners were forced to sell exclusively to the state at prices lower than production costs. Pension funds were compelled to buy government bonds, destroying the life savings of millions. By 2008, basic goods such as food, toilet paper, and fuel were nearly impossible to find. Cancer and HIV patients stopped receiving care, children ceased attending school, and people risked imprisonment for using foreign currency or the black market to survive. Unemployment reached 94%, and inflation became so extreme it defied description. By this point, it seemed the nation had reached its end, yet the downward spiral continued for a while longer with no significant changes. It was not until 2017, when Mugabe was overthrown in a coup and replaced by his vice president, Emerson Mnangagwa, that people began to hope for a more honest government, only to realize the only thing that had changed was the president's name. And that is the story of Robert Mugabe, the man who destroyed a nation without going to war.